Our second panel of the day is exploring the role of standard-setting organizations and the effects of intellectual property rights policies. Collaborative standard-setting organizations provide us with an opportunity to observe the effects of IP policy in action and are informative of the role IP policy may take on a more macroscopic scale. This panel will explore the role that collaborative standards-setting organizations play in the development of new technologies in today's interconnected world, and the role that IPR policies play in fostering the contributions of technology to standardization efforts. So please welcome as panelists Mr. Paul Nikolic, Chairman of the 802 MAN Standards Committee of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, or IEEE. Mr. Jorge Padilla, Senior Managing Director and Head of Compass Lexicon Europe. Mr. Jonas Sundberg, President and Chief Technology Officer of ALENS. I know that I'm going to mess this up. Telecom. Thank you for making it easy on me. And former chairman of the board of the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, otherwise known as ETSI. Professor David Teese, the Tuscher Professor of Global Business at the Haas School of Business, the University of California, Berkeley, and Director of the Institute for Business Innovation. And our moderator for the panel today is Professor Nicolas Petit, Professor of Law at the University of Liège School of Law.
Thank you very much, Mark. When I left Brussels yesterday, I had to explain what this event is about and what the session is about, the Grandma test, and I showed the title of the session, Exploring the Role of SSOs and the Effects of IPR Policies. So showing my smartphone did help, but not for my dad, who has a smartphone but doesn't know how to use it. So he remained very perplexed, and I thought to myself, lucky me, the organizers of that event did not pack more acronyms in the title of the session, like FRIEND, SEPs, LOAs, SSPPU, you name it. Now, I want to make a speculation on the eve of that session. In 5 years at this conference, there will be an introductory session to go through all the legalese. Now, let me just give you a bit of context. We celebrate, or say we contemplate, the passing of 2 years since the IEEE SA updated patent policy took effect. All will recall the stated aim of the policy: provide greater clarity for meaning on reasonable rates. And no doubt the audience equally remains and remembers the main operational changes that were introduced: a certain alteration of the right to injunctive relief, mandatory definition of reasonable rates, and an optional set of 3 factors for the evaluation of reasonable rates during licensing negotiations, including SSPPU. Now, to date, the IEEE initiative has not been really followed by or picked upon by other SSOs in the world. We even observe a degree of fragmentation with large SDOs like Sensenelec in Europe saying expressly that they do not support initiative, I'm quoting, initiatives taken by SSOs to provide guidance on or impose compliance with FRIEND pricing, valuation, and rate setting methodologies. Instead of trying to provide pricing guidance, this SDO has proposed to read in FRIEND a more procedural, or say courtesy type understanding of the pledge. Now, against this backdrop, I think the purpose of this session is sort of attempt to take stock of what had happened in hindsight. Had the IEEE change delayed the standards development process? Can we observe a rate or a change of statistical significance in the submission of LOAs? Before the said organization yesterday evening, Ron Ketzelsson posted on his website a revised update of his analysis of the problem or the issue. His work suggests that since March 15, 2015, the average net submission rate of non-duplicate LOAs declined by 84%. And the anemic state of LOA submission rate has apparently hit a record low in the past 6 months. Now, besides, time also seems right to look ahead. key enabling technologies like 5G or IoT are making way into standard setting organizations and possibly markets across the globe. Agencies and market players are embracing distinct strategies. In Europe, again, where neither SSOs nor the upper courts have really felt a need to clarify trends, we are seeing the European Commission willing to provide guidance through soft law instruments. At the same time, we observe quite a number of initiatives in the private ordering leg of the system. Several market players have been launching a licensing platform called Avanci for IoT technologies with the intent of providing a one-stop licensing shop. We're seeing some degree of activity on the M&A market with vertical integration. And some firms are said to explore the idea of developing technology through workshop agreements within SSOs, which seem less constraining than the standard pipeline used, and in particular technical committees. So we have 75 minutes and 4 very distinguished speakers to run us through those issues and more. And we've decided to start with some views from the trenches, with Paul and Jonas explaining the perspective from the standard setting organizations. When I hear views from the trenches, I think of primarily foot soldiers, but I think we're here talking with commanders in chief. So we'll start with Paul and Jonas, and then Jorge and David and Jorge, in exact order, will provide a more outside perspective on what they feel about what those changes or not changes achieved in terms of innovation and political economy perspectives. So without further ado, Paul, will you start?
Thank you very much, Nicholas, and thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me. I'm an engineer and an entrepreneur and an industry consultant, and I've spent a lot of time with standards development, specifically running the 802 Standards Development Organization. And I'm going to bring to this discussion a view from the coalface, that is, where the actual standards development activity takes place in 802, and try to give this audience an understanding of how we go about doing that, and give you my perspective on what, if any, impact have I observed in 802 with respect to these updated patent policies. I'm also going to try to figure out how to use the slides. So let's see, the green one. All right. So yes, before I share my opinions, I need to make it very clear that these opinions that I'll be sharing are my own and are completely disconnected from the IEEE. I am not an employee of the IEEE. I volunteer my time to run 802. I've been involved in 802 for the past 28 years, first as a member and gradually over time as the leader of 802. And my objective as the chairman of 802 is to provide a neutral, fair platform for the industry to come to develop standards based on what they perceive the market needs to see. So first of all, let me give an overview of the IEEE overall. It's the world's largest professional technical organization. There's some 430,000 members representing 190 plus countries. I'm going to glance at my notes here as opposed to the primary mission of the IEEE, the way I see it, is to collect, vet, and distribute high-quality technical information. And standards development is one of the most intense vetting activities that occurs inside the IEEE. And another important point, at least from the perspective of 802, is that it's not restricted to IEEE members. Anybody that's interested in standards development is welcome to participate in the 802 activities and to fully engage. You do not have to be a member. And I think that's a very important point. So we have a lot of people within 802 that fall into that category. 802, I'm going to give a little perspective on 802. It's comprised of, we're organized into working groups and technical advisory groups. The working groups are the groups that have specific focal areas within 802. The most active groups within 802 are the 4 top ones on that org chart. It's 802.1, which is overview and architecture. They develop the specifications for bridging, time-sensitive networking, and security for 802 that are used with all the other MAC and physical layer standards that are developed. 802.3, which develops all our wireline protocols for fiber, twisted pair, coaxial copper, anything that runs over a wire or a cable is developed within 802.3. Then there's 802.11, which is probably the one that people know the most. They are focused on wireless LANs, very commonly known as the predecessor or the feeder into the Wi-Fi compliance activity. And I think Wi-Fi is very well, it's an unusual environment in that consumers know what Wi-Fi are. Typically, people don't follow what's going on down in the trenches at the standards development. And 802.15 develops wireless standards for personal area networking and sensor networking. And then we've got several smaller groups. I need to move along here. So this chart's my attempt to discuss what the impact of 802 has been over the past 40 years. In the pre-802 days, there were a lot of proprietary networks, and the industry came together and they said, hey, it would be a good idea if we tried to converge on a single method of establishing communications between computers and end devices. This resulted in 802 being formed. The initial idea was it's going to be developing a single standard that's going to cover all applications. Quickly, within a year, it broke up into 3 different activities. Since then, as I mentioned earlier, the emergence of 802.1, 802.3, and 802.11 have been the predominant groups. It's risen in market prominence to where we're seeing hundreds of billions of devices being connected based on the 802 protocol. So there's a very significant volume and societal and economic impact based on 802 standards. One of the questions I was asked was, what, from the trenches perspective, has the impact been of the updated standards policy in 802? And from my perspective, and I spend a huge amount of time in standards development meetings, is there's been no significant impact. Pretty much the work is continuing as it has in the past, and we've got roughly the same number of participants overall. There's about 750 active participants in 802. That hasn't significantly changed in the last 2 years. There's relatively little discussion or concern about the IPR rights within the standards development meetings. I mean, occasionally you see something, but it's nothing significant. I think it's going to be a very long time before you'll see any impact. And I also think it's nearly impossible to quantitatively measure what that impact is, because there's so many variables associated with the growth of a market based on standards and what makes it into standards and what doesn't. So the bottom line is, I haven't seen any day-to-day impact within 802. This is a slide which describes the pipeline which is used for standards development in the early stages, the industry innovators, which can be new companies, individuals, large companies, come up with an idea. There's a new market opportunity. We think that a standard could be developed that would help build that market quickly. And then they come into 802 and we ask them 4 questions. You know, what's the market relevance of this proposed activity? What's the technical feasibility? And what's the economic feasibility? Is it sufficiently different from anything else that we've done already? And is it compatible with everything that we've done? And if they can successfully answer those questions, we start a project. A project then goes into the draft development process. That typically takes about 4 years for people to bring technology proposals to the table, for the group to assess the quality and the value of those proposals, create a draft. Once a draft is created, we circulate it through a balloting process and a comment resolution process where anybody that supplies a comment on a particular portion of the draft we are expected to provide a response to them, whether or not we agree with it, we'll make a change, or we disagree with it, and a particular answer for that disagreement is circulated. And it takes a fair amount of time to build consensus because, as you can imagine, especially for a very competitive marketplace, people want to get their particular technology incorporated into a standard because it potentially could be very financially beneficial. And it takes a lot of time to get the group to come to consensus. Consensus in 802 requires 75% approval of the entire group. But it does work, and 802's been working in this mode for a long time, and it's helped develop quite a robust market based on 802 technologies. Once the standards are published, then the industry builds products, provides services, and provides complementary applications to support that, like conformance testing, compliance testing, and the end users ultimately benefit. This is a little bit of detail on the, recursive process that we go through and create a draft, put it out for comments, and then resolve all the comments, then go back and generate a new draft. And this is what takes the bulk of the time in the standards development process. Here's an example of a project timeline of a project that we're currently right in the middle of developing. It's the 802.11ay 60 gigahertz radio, which is supposed to be developing a physical layer that's going to provide 20 gigabits per second throughput on those radios. And I don't know if you can notice it. I tried to draw lines that have boundaries on years. You'll notice that this project is from start to finish is going to take about 5.5 years. That includes the concept phase, the project start phase, and finally the ballot, develop the draft, the initial draft, the ballot resolution phase. So it's a very long process, and this is typical within 802. And it has not significantly changed as a result of the IPR policy update. Here's what I took a look at. I said, well, let me take some numbers from 802, and these 3 lines, the bottommost line is the number of projects that we're completing per year over the past 5 years. And you can see it's about 12 projects per year, more or less, and it's been pretty consistent over the entire time. The number of projects that we start per year is that middle blue line. And that's pretty consistent, around 18, 19 projects per year. That hasn't changed significantly. And the red line is the number of projects in the pipeline. You can see that's going up because the rate of completion is slower than the rate of start, so the pipeline's expanding over time. And we continue to get new, interesting projects all the time. We just had a plenary session a week ago where we started a new project on multi-gigabit automotive Ethernet. The automotive sector is networking in the automotive sector is a growing sector for the industry, and we started a project specifically to address that particular sector. This chart shows the number of active standards. That's the blue line, and the number of 802 activities. That's roughly about 80 parallel activities within 802. I know my time is up. And the number of standards is stable around 80. I got a couple more slides. Okay, that's the appendix. The appendix, one thing I wanted to mention was we start every single standards meeting with a call for patents. And there are hundreds and hundreds of standards meetings per year. And the number of times somebody raises their hand and says, well, we would like to say that we think that there's a potentially essential patent in this particular area that's being discussed is extremely low, on the order of 1 to 2 times per year per working group. And that hasn't changed. So that's it.
Thank you, Paul. So we are moving on to Jonas, providing a perspective on the IPR policies from the viewpoint of SSOs. Go ahead.
Thank you, Nicholas. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be invited to this Leadership 2017 conference, and I will now share with you my knowledge and experiences from ETSI. And very briefly, ETSI, European Telecommunication Standards Institute, was created 1988 in Sophia Antipolis in France. Next year it will have its 30th anniversary. It's recognized European standards body by European Commission, and it's important to note here that it's independent, non-profit organization and established under French law. Moreover, today ETSI has 789 member companies from more than 63 countries. And I would like to say that we have all the stakeholders present: administrations, network operators, manufacturers, users, service providers, research bodies, universities, consultancy companies, etc. So that's very broad. And then from all parts of the world. So I would say ETSI is the leading body for globally applicable standards for telecommunication and other ICT-related services. And you may know that GSM, UMTS, LTE, DECT, DVB, TETRA is home in ETSI for these world-class standards. In the third generation mobile networks, there was also founding the third generation partnership project in 1998. And there are 6 organizational partners, and I would like to say that they are compatible IPR policies. So they are China, Japan, Korea, India, Europe, and US. A few words about the ETSI IPR database. As of today, there are 243 companies that have made declarations, and they have made 2001 declarations against 8,849 standards, and this covers 207,810 patents. So it's a massive amount of patents we are talking about here. Now entering into the policy discussions, I first start with a few examples that have been discussed and then approved and included into the ETSI IPR policy and also the ETSI guide on IPRs. And one example is the declaration of patent families. It was not there from the beginning, but then later on it was realized that that would be very useful that you declare one patent and then all the patents in the same family belongs to this declaration. This then required also a restructuring of the ETSI IPR database and then made it also possible to do online IPR declaration. And another example is the software copyright that also can be part of a standard, and how to deal with that was also included in the IPR policy and the guide. Another successfully completed topic here is the transfer of a patent subject to FRAND licensing commitment. It was industry and regulators that raised concerns. What happened if you have made an IPR declaration to ETSI and then you sell this, or it gets transferred forth and back and so on, what happens then with your commitment to license on FRAND terms? And there was then clarification to this, and then the IPR policy was updated, and also the guide was updated. So these commitments continue when you transfer a patent. Then there are other examples that are not that straightforward, I would say. And now I have 4 examples here. The first one is FRAND. And the main question around this is that some member companies have raised this item and would like to have better guidance and principles for compensation elements under the FRAND commitments. And, for example, common base and what is appropriate rate, etc. And then some are also suggesting that there should be this FRAND should be based on the smallest sellable unit or product that or device or whatever you can have. But I would like to say that the discussions have been very diverse, not converging on this subject, and they are not concluded, and many are of the view that this meaning of FRAND and so on, this should not be dealt with in a standards body. A standards development organization should develop the standards, and these matters should be handled outside. So commercial terms outside the standards body. Another topic is reciprocity. In this, in the current declaration form for IPRs to ETSI, there is a box where you can tick in that if you agree to reciprocate your IPR. This is voluntarily, and this is another subject that has been raised and discussed in length. I mean, these topics I'm bringing up here, there are several years in the ETSI IPR Special Committee that have been discussing arguments for them and against and so on. And also on this, it's deemed to be that this is left to the owner of the patent to decide upon this, and it's not for the standards body to start regulating on this. So no conclusion, discussions are still ongoing. Another hot topic is injunctive relief. Some are of the opinion that this is, so to say, your constitutional right, if you are the IPR owner, to use this in the last resort. Others think that no, ETSI should regulate this, and you should take away the possibility of injunctive relief, or at least you should reduce the possibilities to absolute minimum when you can use the injunctive relief. So this is also a topic that's no conclusion reached and discussions ongoing. Then a more recent topic that has come up is called increased transparency. And here we are down to the details now on this IPR declaration form, and in particular 2 items there. Should you make mandatory to fill in the standard, and also in the illustrative specific part of the standard, for example, section, marked here as red, should this too be mandatory to be filled in? If you don't do this, then this IPR declaration will be rejected by the ETSI Secretariat. Currently, this is not mandatory, and I can say one reason for that has been that you don't know if you do this declaration early which are the sections and so on, and that can change and so on. And this the administrative burden to handle all this. So these were now 4 topics that have been discussed in length, but so far with no conclusion. And now a few words about that. Why is it so? Well, we believe that, or I believe that this is a complex legal and business landscape. There are different national patent laws and law concepts. I mean, you just take it within Europe, there are different, this is national laws to handle, and then outside even changes more. And there are also taking place legal developments from regulators and courts, and some of the members that participate in ETSI and the ETSI special IPR special committee are in litigation, and that makes the whole thing very sensitive to sit there and discuss the topics. But there is an obligation for members to follow the ETSI IPR policy. that there is no doubt about that. But then the main question is, what does it contain? So I would like then to say a few words more that these markets and IPR policies of SSOs are global. Think about 3G, 4G, etc. These are global markets that goes all over the world. And there is also very high stakes for all involved. I mean, some companies have business models and they are ETSI members that are very diverse and sometimes in direct conflict. And there are companies who strongly contributed their innovation to standardization and have based their business models on successfully selling products as well as getting reward for negotiated use of their IPRs on a worldwide basis. These are facts. So many times the questions in the ETSI IPR Special Committee comes to, is this proposal a modification, a change, or a clarification? And the meaning of this is very big, whether you do a change or you just clarify something that everybody has interpreted like this. And then when you do a modification, can you apply this retroactively or not? That's the big question. And I think it's very difficult to apply laws or these IPR policies retroactively. So to conclude on this subject, I will strongly believe that the ETSI IPR policy is a key element for the success of ETSI's globally applicable standards. Fair balance of all the interests involved. And this allows members to fully reserve the IPRs, have been and still is an incentive for high technology companies to participate in the standardization process, enabling both ETSI and 3GPP to draft excellent high quality standards. And with respect to the other subjects on the items and so on, I just can say that the discussion will continue.
Okay, thank you, Jonas, for that. Now we have David in the call. We said that you would tell us what you think of attempts to provide clarity and balance and what that has in terms of impact on innovation. So you go ahead.
Sure, I'll talk at a rather general level rather than the specifics of policies, and begin with the preamble I found very helpful, which is, first of all, let's distinguish between standard setting and standards development. Jonas pointed out that at ETSI there's 207,000 patents. Behind that, of course, there's hundreds of millions of dollars of R&D that are being spent. And when we get beyond this room and talking to the public in general, we keep using the word standard setting, and people think it's about deciding between equally good alternatives, when in fact what is involved here is a culmination of accumulative research activities spanning many companies in many countries involving billions of dollars. So we can't take this subject lightly, and nor can we assume that companies are going to continue to invest in the enabling technologies, if in fact the policies are written in a way that doesn't reward them appropriately. So hardly necessary with this group to make this distinction, but as we talk to policy analysts and as I talk to my colleagues in economics, they have no clue that really what standards development is about is sitting on, or standard setting is about, is sitting on top of a tremendous amount of economic activity. That said, what are the key elements of standard setting policies? And no matter which organization you look at, IEEE or EDC, they're at least in the initial intent was to strike a balance between adoption and creation. That we realize that yes, we want standards to be adopted, but of course we want technology to be developed as well. And how does one, in fact, write rules to make that right? Well, there has, and I earlier on said that there's some benefits to clarity with respect to behavioral rules inside standard setting bodies, but there's also some benefit to ambiguity, particularly when you have the enormous heterogeneity that exists between countries, between firms, and between individual standards. So, in my view, enormous benefit in allowing the private negotiation to work under some general rubric around what fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory is. And of course, that does require that you make licenses available. The non-exclusivity is a key part, and being reasonable and non-discriminatory, of course, is something that warrants further attention. As an economist, when I think about this, and when I read through both the ETSI policy and where perhaps IEEE used to be, it seems to me the way to frame it is what is the rate that actually keeps the innovation system vibrant, the ecosystem vibrant, not just adoption, but also development. And this is not, a relevant market issue. When economists think about this, they always want to frame things in traditional ways. But I think the right way to think about, Fran, is that behind it all, we have to keep a vibrant ecosystem supporting innovation and the adoption of innovation. Both go hand in hand. Now, how does one, in fact, ensure ecosystem health? As I said before, I think this negotiation is the best way to go. But the IEEE has jumped in and, in my view, messed it up. Paul may be right that there isn't yet much clear evidence of that, although there is some evidence of that. But the concern is that some of these ideas that have come from the economics profession have been misapplied. The notion that somehow rather rates or Fran should be some ex ante rate, whatever that is, but ex ante only when you think about what's being put forward, it's actually interim ex ante. It's not before anyone makes an investment. The way it's been used by IEEE and by some economists is to say, let's take for granted what the innovator does, but let's protect what the implementer has to do. And that is clearly a very one-eyed and an imbalanced view of what ex ante really means. But I won't really dwell on that at great length. I will simply jump to something which certainly in the ETSI context I think is even more important. And that is that when you think about the technologies that are being governed, if for want of a better word, by ETSI and which shape standards, and particularly as you look forward into 5G, what really strikes me is that many of the technologies are what I call enabling technologies or general purpose technologies. And that raises a whole set of new issues. There's an economics literature that was kicked off by the historians, actually, that remarked on the fact that there's some technologies that just are so pervasive in their effect that they can actually move the needle with respect to national income. And they depend in part on downstream innovation and complementary innovation. And that what is also true when you have enabling technologies is that the spillover benefits is just simply humongous. I mean, think about the laser, which has application in hundreds of different areas, from telecommunications itself through to medical products, through to to many other areas, land leveling and what have you, that often when these technologies are discovered, these applications may not be known, and the development of the applications actually leads to further development in the initial technology. And I think that many of the communications technologies that are under review are ones that are in the form of enabling technology. So this ecosystem idea helps you get your arms around this. In the past, these things have been looked at, in my view, in too narrow a way. Now, once you recognize that these technologies are enabling technologies, that takes you to some work that economists have done on the social returns to innovation. Well, first of all, the social returns to any innovation are almost always greater than the private returns. In other words, if you look at the spillovers and you add that back in, the social return is usually many times what the private return is. Or put differently, those that invest in innovative activities really struggle to get rewarded for it in the best of circumstances. Ed Mansfield, who was my old advisor when I was a graduate student at Penn, did the first study along these lines, and he showed the lower bound on the rate of the social rate of return was 58%, and firms that were investing were making maybe 11 or 12%, but the social return was 58%. Tim Bresnahan at Stanford has done work that shows that with respect to mainframe computers, the social returns were 5 times the cost. Manuel Trautenberg shown the benefit-cost ratio with a lot of medical imaging technology is over 270%. All of this simply goes to say that we have two problems with the whole question of standard essential patents. One is making sure that there is adequate return as between the adopter and the innovator, but there's an even broader set of returns, and that once you enter into a FRAND agreement, you essentially require licensing, and that limits your business model choices. And so if you're stuck with licensing as a primary way to capture returns, you're stuck with a business model that is really quite limited, particularly given where patent law has been going. So all of this is simply to say that I think for me at least, the interesting new angle here is that we ought to be thinking in terms of the health of the ecosystem. It's true that neither ETSI or IEEE provided a lot of granularity around what they were trying to do, what the original intent is. But if you go back and read the documents, the best I can come up with is that they were fundamentally concerned about the health of the innovation ecosystem. Not just adoption, certainly not just invention, but both. And that's the way it should be looked at now. And in that regard, if you throw in the fact that not in all circumstances, but in some circumstances, what may be at issue is standards that sitting on top of fundamental enabling technology. And as you think through the rewards for that, then at least the policymakers, in my view, and the courts should be alert to that, and the notion that one should try and chisel down returns, which comes from the popularity contest. Remember, in almost all circumstances, there's always more adopters than there are contributors. And if you go to the pure politics of standard setting, and you ask for a hand count, and people just give you their self-interest, there are more adopters than there are contributors. It's always the case. So folks like us in this room have to be in the forefront of making sure that society's longer-term interests is guarded, and making the case that the health of this ecosystem fundamentally depends on, in fact, sufficient rewards to keep the technology flowing and to keep the hundreds of thousands of engineers and others who are contributing to technology development continuously employed in creative activities that benefit us all. So that's my little preamble.
Thank you. I'm very grateful you made it in 10 minutes, so we have more time for follow-up questions. Jorge, maybe you have a need for an additional minute, so there's probably a sort of secret agreement between you and David. You go ahead.
We economists collude pretty well.
Right, got that.
So we have one SDO that has decided to change its IPR policy. we have an SDO that has considered whether to change the IPR policy but hasn't changed the IPR policy. That raises a number of questions. Why did the SDO that changed the policy decided to do it? Why did the SDO that decided not to change it decided to do that? What are the effects of changing IPR policies? Can those effects be measured? And if we cannot quantify them easily, can we try to infer the likely effects by looking at the motivations behind those changes in policy? And now, these are all very complicated questions that, in order to be answered, would require lots of evidence and some theory. And we don't have much of either. And I'm an empirical economist, so I think that ultimately what should matter is evidence. But I think that I'm also old enough to understand that without a theory, a proper theory, you cannot interpret facts correctly. And what's more, you may be unable to distinguish between facts and alternative facts. So what I'm going to give you is a bit of theory, a theoretical framework, which I guess that is going to be particularly interesting for those that are more sort of academic in the audience, but that I think that will help us all to put in place the various debates that we're having today and the things that we can discuss later. So what we have here is a simple representation of the relationship between an SDO and its members. And we are going to have innovators, and we're going to have adapters, and we have a government that hopefully represents the interests of consumers. And all those members treat the SDO as a common agent. The SDO is there to undertake a number of decisions, but to represent, in one way or another, the interest of its constituency. One of the key decisions of the SDO, one of the key long-term decisions of the SDO, is to choose its IPR policy. And that IPR policy is going to have a number of implications, real implications. And for that, I mean they're going to have that those decisions are going to have implications on the level of investment undertook by the innovators, the level of investment of the adopters, the prices that prevail in the market, the royalty rates that we observe, and also output and consumer welfare. And what I want to do in this presentation is actually to look at all these things. First, I want to consider what is the impact in the market of different IPR policies. Secondly, I want to, for a second, look at what would be the optimal IPR policy. And thirdly, I want to see at the sad reality and look at an SDO like the process in which the sausage is made. And I want to look at how the sausage is made and try to understand the motivations behind the choice of IPR policy. For that, I need a model. And in this model, I'm going to have a number of agents. I'm going to have an SDO, I'm going to have an adopter, I'm going to have an innovator, and I'm going to have a government that, for most of my model, most of the time is going to represent the interests of consumers. And what we're going to see is that the first thing that I want to model is what the choice of the IPR policy is. Now, the IPR policy in this model is very simple. It's just a parameter, beta. That means the bargaining power of the innovator vis-a-vis the adopter. Because ultimately, the choice of IPR policy is the choice of who holds the bargaining power in the licensing negotiation. That's what the discussion about injunctive relief is. That is what is the discussion about the meaning of friend, and so on and so forth. Given that IPR policy, that bargaining power, what I will analyze is what are the investment decisions made by innovator and adopter. Third stage, they will sit down and they will negotiate royalty rates. Fourthly, we will have to look at what are the implications of all those decisions for market prices and output. Output is a demand function, which grows with the investment made by the innovator, but also with the investment made by the adopter, and obviously falls with price. These models, for those of you that know a little bit of game theory, are solved backwards. We first look at the last decision, the last problem, and then we work our way backward. So the first thing that we would have to do is to understand what is the pricing policy, pricing decision of the adopter as a function of everything else. I'm not going to give you all the details. There is lots of algebra. What you can prove is that that price is going to be a function of the royalty rate. What happens in terms of the royalty rate is going to influence market prices. And since we will see that the royalty rate is a function of the bargaining power of innovator and adopter, then we will see that the IPR policy of the SDO is going to have an impact on prices and is going to have an impact on output. One step backwards, royalty rate negotiation. Both parties will sit. Their bargaining power is affected, conditioned by the IPR policy, and that will be reflected in the royalty rate. We need to move backwards. Investment. The parties, adopter and innovator, will make their investment decisions. Those investment decisions are going to be a function of what happens later. What is the degree of appropriability of those investments? What are the royalty rates, therefore? And hence, those investments are going to be a function of the IPR policy. The IPR policy, therefore, has an impact on everything else that happens in the market, on the levels of investment of the innovator and the adopter, and also market prices. A shift in IPR policy, for example, a move to reduce the bargaining power of the innovator, is going to reduce the investment of that innovator. That's what the theory would tell us, and that's what we would expect to see in the marketplace. Of course, it's going to have offsetting effects. The adopter may invest more, and prices may be higher or lower. But the effect of the IPR policy is unlikely to be neutral. We may take a little bit more time or less time. And it's those effects that we should measure on. The most important thing, the most important effect of a change in IPR policy is not what happens within the SDO. That's important as well. The most important effect of a change in IPR policy is going to be eventually in how the market operates and therefore on the welfare of consumers. What is an optimal IPR policy? Well, here we economists, we're welfarist. We will say it has to be a policy that represents the interests of all the patrons, of all the owners, of the entire constituency of the SDO. It has to balance the interest of the innovator, the adopter, and the government, i.e. Consumers. But what is likely to happen in reality? Well, what is likely to happen in reality is that the SDO is unlikely to maximize that total welfare function. It may attribute different weights, different importance to different parties, different members of the organization. And what I think that we need to do in order to understand the motivation of why one SDO changes its policy and another one doesn't, is to try to look at to understand what determines those weights. And for that, we also have a body of economic literature that can help us. And what we're going to see is that there are things such as governance that will matter. Who controls the SDO decision making? Is that a government-sponsored standard? And therefore, the SDO in one way or another is going to represent or reflect the views of the government? Then we may have a SDO that actually is stingy with respect to innovators and more favorable to the interest of consumers and possibly of adopters. Even more so if the government not only represents or is not only driven by consumer welfare considerations, but by, for example, it takes into account employment. Or if the government is static because the political cycle leads to short-termism in government policy and neglects the influence that the decisions of the SDO are going to have on investment decisions, and in particular in the investment of the innovator. And that's the point I was making there. Then we need to be aware, and I have difficulty in looking at these slides, we need to be aware about what happens within the SDO. We need to model the advocacy game. It may well be that the government has much less information about what is the impact of a change in IPR policy on the market that the innovator and the adopter have. And then the innovator and the adopter will try to communicate to other members, other constituents, other parties within the SDO about what are the likely effects of different IPR policies. And we're going to see communication, and we're going to see advocacy games. And the question that we need to ask ourselves is whether we need to change the rules of the SDOs so that those manipulations, those strategies are minimized. And also whether we need to encourage SDOs and other institutions to provide with their members or the members of the SDOs with accurate information about what the implications of the changes in IPR policies are so that we don't see these special interest politics games being played within SDOs. And advocacy is not just the only thing that may move the SDO in one direction or the other. We may have direct campaign contributions. We may have problems with revolving doors. We need to understand how the sausage is made, because otherwise we won't be able to answer the question, why did this SDO move in that direction and this other one didn't move in that direction? And because given the complications and the complexity and difficulties in trying to measure the long-term effects of changes in SDO policy, we need to understand the motivations behind, because they may tell us, they may give us the answer about what is the likely impact of those policy changes. Thank you very much.
Well, Jorge, thank you so much. I mean, it looks like collusion's very efficient in that particular market. All right, so I would like to provide an opportunity for each of the panelists to maybe rebound on each other's statements. Keep your declarations short so we have some time for the Q&A. Paul.
Okay, first of all, it's interesting what's going on with Etsy in the sense that they're trying to figure out what to do with respect to their IPR policy, and they're basically deciding not to do anything, leave things alone. So potentially Etsy, the environment in Etsy can be compared and contrasted against the environment in the IEEE. It would be interesting if we could come up with some quantitative way of assessing what the differences are from a market perspective. I think that's what our economists are suggesting we should attempt to do. I fully agree with what David's suggested, that we really need to keep the innovation system vibrant. That's critical to the overall health of the world economy, not just the U.S. economy or specific countries' economies. The question is, how do we go about doing that? And what Jorge is suggesting is that we need to build models and attempt to measure what the impact is, and use that to help shape policy is a very good theoretical approach. But my question for Jorge is, he stated that the royalty rates are a function of bargaining power. Then bargaining power is a function of IPR policy. How in God's name do we measure bargaining power? That is, I think, the underlying question is, we don't have access to the data to tell us what the impact of the IPR policy is, because it's private, it's between companies. They're the ones that decide what the royalty rate should be. And personally, and I'm not speaking for the IEEE once again, I think that's a good thing. It should be up to the entities, the innovators and the adopters, to figure out what's fair and what's reasonable. And that's the best we can do. I don't know that we can do any better than that.
All right, do you want to say something about that just now?
Yeah, I'll address that to the extent that I can. I think that we economists are very difficult in analyzing games in which the result, I'm thinking about European football, soccer, games in which the result is like 3-2 or 2-1, but we're pretty good when it goes to 1-0-0-1. So there are certain IPR policy changes that actually have such a dramatic impact on relative bargaining power that then it's relatively easy to understand what's going to happen. So, for example, if in the context of that we're discussing today, we consider what is the impact of the 9 and IP holder injunctive relief, then we have a very clear answer. Injunctive relief is basically the only credible threat that an IP holder has vis-a-vis licensees. And given that IP holders don't have outside options, or typically have very limited outside options, because if you don't make money from that licensee, you don't make money from that licensee, that's the end of it, then I think that we know what the impact of that is. That is basically diluting the bargaining power of the IP holder to a point in which it's very likely that it will not be able to obtain an appropriate remuneration for its investment. That's a 1-0 outcome. That's like when Germany plays soccer, it wins typically 1-0. That's easy to understand. And I think that that's one instance in which, when that happens within the context of an SDO, that's when an SDO is making a change in IPR policy that has a dramatic impact on bargaining power, and that's going to cascade in terms of royalty rates and innovation. That's easy. There will be others that are complicated. But fortunately or unfortunately, depending on the perspective that you take, those that propose those IPR changes are looking for 1-0 or 0-1 outcomes. They're not looking for the change in IPR policy that at the margin changes things a little bit. Is about winner takes all. And so the typical discussions, the 4 elements that Etsy is not deciding about are 4 dimensions of an IPR policy that would have the same dramatic impact on IPR. And therefore, I think that they're making the life of the economies easier than other problems that we face.
So we need another European to play ball with you. So I'm looking at Jonas. What do you want to say about that?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I would like to refer first to David when he said that this ecosystem, I mean, with this wireless technology is a huge ecosystem, and in my view is proven to work since we started with the first generation and then second generation, and then the third became global. So I think it's very important to have fair compensation to the innovators. That I think is a cornerstone. And I would also like to say that the current ETSI IPR policy, in my view, is very well functioning, because I take just one example now. There are companies that were not present when the second generation standardization started, but they have entered the market and they are giant today, and this makes it possible that you can participate and come into this ecosystem even if you haven't been there from the beginning. So I think this is another proof point on this. So I agree with Jörg regarding the injunctive relief, that if you take that away, then you dilute the whole system. This is, as I say, the last resort to come to a conclusion. If you take that away, then I mean, you risk the whole, that there will be no fair compensation to the innovators anymore. And what will then happen? As a consequence, no one dares to invest in innovation and technology and bring this to the market for everybody then to use in a global scale.
Okay, David, I just want to add just another question, because I was piqued by your remark on some merits of ambiguity. I mean, there's some economic literature which is quite interesting on the value of soft commitments and extra legal devices in promoting exchange and cooperation, gifts, oath, and those kinds of things. And it seems that in that debate we are sort of channeled by contract lawyers. They want to put a sort of binding force on the friend commitment, and that seems to not understand that commitments of soft or ambiguous content can nonetheless promote exchange and cooperation. So if you could just say something about that.
Yes, I think one should distinguish between ambiguity at the SDO and ambiguity in the law. I think uncertainty in the law is very pernicious, and in fact, the problem is that antitrust has been injected into intellectual property and just caused mass confusion. Well, not mass confusion, but significant confusion, and that leads to holdout and so forth. So I think you need clarity in the underlying law, but not necessarily in the rules of the SDO, and keeping a zone of ambiguity to allow for the enormous heterogeneity, which, as Jonas has pointed out, is now being dramatically augmented by the introduction of hundreds of new players into the handset end of the business. So I think that distinguishing between what goes on inside the SDO and what goes on in the law are two different things. You want clarity in the law. But let me come back to Jorge's model, which is very interesting, and I have a question for him, actually, which is you only had three players, which was the innovators, the adopters, and the government. But when I think about what's impacted the change in IPR rules, actually I think some misplaced academic research may be a major contributor. So I'm reminded of the famous quote from Keynes that policymakers may think that they're coming up with original ideas, but they're actually reflecting what some academic scribbler of a decade earlier said. So perhaps you would bring that into your model by saying that those ideas were co-opted or they greased the skids for the adopters to essentially bring about IPR policy. But I think you almost need a separate box for bad academic research to really have a model that's predictive.
Because I was so terrified. With the time deadline that Nikolai had said that he was going to enforce violently, and I didn't know what violently meant. I actually jump quickly through the last slide, but the last slide actually talks about, not about academics in particular, but it talks about how different members within the SDO may look for, I think that I'm calling extraneous support.
Okay.
So those may be academics or maybe antitrust agencies from one country or another, trying to impose constraints on the SDO and using that third-party support, extraneous support, to basically tell the SDO, well, actually, you cannot choose alpha I, alpha A, or alpha G. It has to be all for the adopter and nothing for anyone else. So I think that point taken, and modestly I try to reflect that into the model.
And to be clear, I mean, some of the research is very good, but it's not understood, and the assumptions are not spelled out, and that's where the mischief has come from.
Okay, thank you. Paul, you just wanted to say something?
Yeah, I've got a question for Jorge. You said, what I'm interested in is identifying exactly what can we measure to assess the impact of IPR policy. And what I heard you say was, well, we could look at the requests for injunctive relief as being a possible measure. And if there's a healthy number of requests for injunctive relief, then, we're providing, more power to the innovators. But going back to the previous panel, I thought there was a very good analogy which stated that there's only 10% of the activity is public in terms of what we see in terms of litigation and requests for injunctive relief and letters of assurance, and 90% of the activity occurs out of sight. And also what Judge Michel said was, back in the 90s, there was almost no litigation with respect to IPR. And is that an indicator that things were in good shape, or they were not in good shape because it wasn't obvious that we were giving support to innovators? I still think we have a fundamental problem, is that we don't know how to measure what the impact is.
I acknowledge and agree that the measurement issues are complicated. I think ultimately, frankly, I don't think that we care about the number of LOAs or any other intermediate metric. Ultimately, we want to understand whether the level of innovation and investment is optimal, whether also there is a level of adoption that is optimal. We are using everything else as a proxy for that, and measuring all those things are complicated. That's why I was proposing in this brief presentation that we need to understand the motivations behind the policy changes in order to infer what the likely outcomes of those policy changes are going to be. If we see a policy change that, like for example, a policy that affects the right to seek injunctions, and we see that that's driven by a particular group within the SDO, we can infer what that's going to be, what impact that's going to have in terms of innovation. And then I think that based on other pieces of evidence that we have, we can determine whether that is a good one or a bad one. So if we see that there is a policy change that actually leads to under-remuneration, that is going to lead to less remuneration for innovators, and we see that is driven fundamentally by adopters, not even by those that represent consumers, we may be worried that the problem that David was mentioning before, the under-remuneration of IP, the fact that the private remuneration of IP is below the social remuneration of IP, may be aggravated, and then conclude that that's going to be bad for society as a whole. And I think that that's the sort of exercise that I am proposing, one that tries to avoid having to wait 10 years to see whether the investment and innovation in the Wi-Fi world is going to be as buoyant, as good or less than in Etsy, because we have a randomized policy experiment, but it may take way too long to decide what is the best outcome.
All right, so Mark Snyder tells me we have 5 more minutes for collecting questions from the audience on SSOs, European footballs, or German sausages. So you go ahead, you say your name and the organization you work for, please.
Hello. This is Steve Swedlow from Quinn Emanuel, and this question is really for people who know how the sausage is made within the SSOs. So the bargaining power discussion that we've had, which is defined in part by the IPR, or the IPR policy, is also defined by the enforcement rights that are left over after the IPR policy. And those enforcement rights in the United States and elsewhere has changed drastically over the past decade. But it doesn't appear from the access to information we have that IPR policies have actively considered being revised based upon the enforcement equilibrium, so that it's not just the IPR policy, but it's the IPR policy in light of the United States patent infringement enforcement rights for unencumbered patents. And it seems like that piece, I wonder how much that has been discussed at the SSOs.
Okay, so that's a question for Jonas and Paul. And to give some context, I mean, we hear in Brussels that the European Commission is seeking to advance soft law and licensing principles, possibly due to the fact that the SSOs in Europe didn't manage to make their homework. And so there's some concern in some constituency that the European Commission will actually move on into that space. So Jonas and maybe Paul?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, but I mean, as I outlined here, in the ETSI IPR Special Committee, we have representatives from all the stakeholders, including companies that headquartered here in US, and we have also European Commission representatives participating. So all of them are injecting views, and broad discussions are going on. But the problem is that everything of this is so diverged, so you have difficulties to converge to a policy change. So yes, all are aware of what's going on, but still it's no agreement to change.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I was not involved in the change of the IPR policy at the IEEE. I did not engage in that discussion and debate, so I can't comment on that. I can comment on the level of vibrancy and innovation within 802 over the last 30 years that I've been active. And it is just as strong and just as robust as it was back when I started. It's just grown and it continues to grow. So from my perspective, on the factory floor that's making the sausage, everything's okay.
Okay, so I see a lot of hands. So there's a lady in the back, and we'll collect another question from Richard Tafet, and that's two for the moment. Go ahead.
Good morning, Urška Petrovčić, Criterion Economics. I have two questions. First is a very general question and refers to the SEP holders' commitment to license on FRAND terms. Do you believe that for a given SEP portfolio, FRAND refers to a point royalty, or there is a range of royalties that for that specific portfolio could be FRAND? And the second question is probably for the two representatives of SSOs. So I understand that industry standards include both technologies that are available in the public domain and technologies that are covered by patents. Do you have a general sense of what percentage of a standard is comprised of technologies that are in the public domain?
Okay. Richard? You have a mic? You had a question, no? You had a question.
Yes, thank you.
Go ahead.
Just a quick point. Do you want them to answer the question first, or you want me to just...
No, we'll collect them.
Okay, so just a quick point on Steve Swerdlow's question. Reference should be made to the Dell decision in 1996, and there was a tremendous amount of activity within the SSOs to react to that. Second, in JEDEC specifically, in reaction to the Rambus decision, there were specific policy changes made. That was point one. A question for the panel, though, and maybe to Jorge, and the question really is, before getting into the type of detailed economic analysis that you were trying to ascertain, wouldn't it make some sense to start perhaps more at first principles, to recognize or to inquire first whether the type of change that was made in the IEEE was in reaction to any kind of observable market distortion that occurred? which might inform, one, the motivations that could occur. And related to that is, and listening to Paul, looking at the data and his impressions on 802 generally, whether you would see a very, very different picture if you looked at, for example, 802.11, where a lot of the focus really has occurred, and where you could really look at, from a fundamental basis, an IPR policy, if we assume, is intended to balance the interests of everybody. Simply the fact that there has now been, historically, as far as I know, for the first time, negative LOAs, or where people say, "I will not license," and this comes from the contributor, the primary contributors to the entire process, that in itself is a friction that causes distortion within the standard setting process.
So first question, friend, royalty points, royalty range. Who take that? Go ahead.
With respect to friend, I believe it is a range, and there's both issues relating to the FR and the ND piece, and I think that one way to think about it is that similarly situated companies should have similar rates. What does similarly situated means? Well, believe it or not, in the field of strategic management, we talk about strategic groups. And so companies that have the same strategies, organization, structure, and so forth are more similarly situated than companies that don't. So there are ways to start thinking systematically about those types of issues.
Okay. Now there was a question about how much technology is in the public domain as opposed to intellectual property protected.
Right.
Paul, go ahead.
So I have no clue. We don't measure that. We don't try to measure it. It's unknowable in my view. I mean, there's an amalgam of stuff that's developed via groupthink versus companies bringing in specific approaches versus let's use what's already been done before that's in the public domain. And to my knowledge, no one measures that. It would be an interesting thing to take a look at.
More work for academics. Jonas, want to say something about that?
Yeah, I think it's very. I agree with Paul here that this is very difficult to measure. I mean, but what counts is when you have an innovation and bring that to the standard, then of course it becomes public after that. So I don't know really the question what to measure here. I mean, there cannot be secret innovations because they cannot be part of the standard. So they, I think, a little bit complex to measure. In the standard, everything becomes public.
All right. So then we had the last question by Richard that was addressed to Jorge and Paul. Can you please react to that question?
So, I mean, I wasn't in there, but I can try to provide an answer from the outside. So from the outside, and I think that you know my views, that I don't see that there is evidence of royalty stacking on holdup, and therefore I don't understand why those changes, I don't think that those changes would be motivated by those problems. Listening to Paul, it's not clear that the changes were motivated by the need to make the performance of the SDO more vibrant, because it was vibrant already and continues to be vibrant. Therefore, I have to conclude that the change was mainly intended to shift bargaining power in upcoming negotiations. And that leads me to one point that I think is important, which is that I think that there is a difference between setting the IPR policy of an SDO de novo in issue and setting the IPR policy of an SDO that has already proved successful, because a change in IPR policy at that level may be actually an actual example of holdup.
Paul?
So specifically to Richard's question, and we discussed this a little bit last night, would it be different if we zoomed in on 802.11 versus 802 overall? Yes, it would be different. Also, you had a question about the impact of negative LOAs. Yes, we're seeing negative LOAs now, but it hasn't stopped standards from being approved. There are a couple standards that were approved in December, 802.11AI and 802.11AH, that I believe have negative LOAs on record against them, and both standards were approved. So so the question is, are LOAs and the various classes of LOAs a valid measure of whether or not this IPR policy is helpful or harmful? I don't know. let me restate it. Does that suggest the failing of the IEEE's patent policy itself? I don't know. I'm going to leave it up to the audience to think on their own about it.
All right, so it's really time to close. We've been beyond the schedule. I want to thank the panelists for their engaging comments and presentations. I want to recast my early prediction as well, and I want to be more optimistic. Hopefully there's no need for a conference on all those acronyms in 5 years, and we won't need a translation panel. We have machine intelligence to do that, but beyond, I'm sure our collective intelligence will have moved us to more pressing and frontier issues. So a big round of applause for all of them, and thanks for your attention.